He didn't say goodbye. That was the part that gutted her most. Dante Moretti, the man who kissed her temple every morning, who remembered she took her coffee with 2 sugars and no milk, who once drove 40 minutes in a snowstorm just to bring her ibuprofen, walked out of their penthouse at 11:17, like she wasn't even standing there. Coat already on. Keys already in hand. Eyes already somewhere else. Selena stood in the kitchen doorway in her socks, a half-eaten sandwich on the counter behind her, watching him leave for the 19th night in a row. Counted. She wasn't proud of that, but she'd counted. Dante. He paused at the door, didn't turn around. Business, he said, and then he was gone. If you have ever loved someone who made you feel invisible in your own home, someone who could walk past you like you were furniture, like your voice was just background noise, then you already know what Elena felt standing in that kitchen. You already know the specific kind of sick that settles in your chest when you realize you've stopped being seen. And if you've ever stayed anyway, kept the faith anyway, told yourself it would make sense eventually, then this story is for you. Hit that like button, subscribe so you never miss what comes next, and drop your city or country in the comments right now. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Because what Aina was about to find behind that locked iron gate, it would change everything she thought she knew about love, loyalty, and the man she was about to marry. This is a work of cinematic fiction created entirely for entertainment. All characters, locations, organizations, and events are completely imagined. The first time Elena Voss noticed Dante Moretti leaving at exactly 11:17 p.m., she told herself she was imagining things. She'd checked the clock only because she couldn't sleep her mind doing that thing it always did after midnight, cycling through half-finished thoughts and old anxieties like a washing machine with too much load. She'd heard the elevator ping from the bedroom, heard his shoes on the marble floor, heard the penthouse door close with that particular heavy click that told her it was definitely shut, not almost shut, not still ajar. Done. Final. She'd rolled over and stared at the ceiling and told herself it was a one-time thing. Except it wasn't. The second night, she caught herself watching the clock from the couch. 11:15, 11:15, 11:16. At 11:17, Dante came out of his office, coat already on, and crossed the living room without looking at her. She was sitting right there, book open in her lap, light on. Dante, she said. He stopped. His hand was already on his phone. He didn't look up when he answered. Business. That was it. One word clipped at both ends, tossed over his shoulder like a scrap. And she took it. She nodded and said nothing, and listened to the elevator carry him down into the city. She told herself she trusted him. She told herself this was what she'd signed up for when she agreed to marry a man whose last name carried the weight that the Moretti name did in Chicago. She'd known from the beginning that there would be parts of his world she couldn't touch. She'd accepted that, but acceptance has a shelf life. And 3 weeks into the nightly disappearances, Elena Voss had run out of it. She'd met Dante at a charity auction 2.5 years ago, the kind of overlit event where everyone was dressed too carefully and smiling too precisely, and the wine was good, but never quite good enough to make up for the conversation. Elena had been there on behalf of the non-profit she worked for, cataloging silent auction items and trying not to make eye contact with anyone who looked like they wanted to talk about their investment portfolio. Dante had appeared at the table beside her, without introduction, picked up the bid sheet for a vintage photograph she'd been admiring, and written a number that made her blink. You didn't have to do that, she'd said, because the amount was absurd. Said. And he'd looked at her then, really looked the kind of attention that felt like being caught in a spotlight. I wanted to. She'd been suspicious of him from the start. That was the honest truth. Men who looked like Dante Moretti, dark eyes, unhurried movements, a stillness that somehow made him, the gravitational center of every room, did not usually direct that quality of focus at someone like Elena. She was not beautiful in the way that stopped traffic. She was fine-looking. She knew that, but she was also practical and a little too blunt, and she laughed too loudly at things most people just smiled politely at. She was not a woman who expected to be chosen by men like Dante Moretti. But he'd found her number through channels she still didn't fully understand, called her 3 days after the auction, and asked her to dinner in a tone that somehow wasn't arrogant, even though the assumption underneath it absolutely was. And she'd said yes, because she was human. and because something in his voice made her curious in a way she couldn't quite explain or dismiss. 3 months later, she knew about the Morty Empire in the way that people who love powerful men come to know things partially, selectively, and always slightly behind the actual truth. She knew that Dante's father, Carmine Moretti, had built something enormous and ugly out of Chicago's South Side, and that Dante had inherited it not as a gift, but as a trap. She knew that Dante moved through that world with a kind of calculated control, always measured, always composed, always the coldest person in any given room. She knew that people feared him, and that she was one of the only people who had ever seen him laugh with his whole body, genuinely, until his shoulders shook. She loved that version of him. She'd built her trust on that version. So when the nighttime disappearances started 6 weeks before their wedding, she didn't panic immediately. She waited. She watched. She gave him room that she wasn't sure he deserved. Clock kept reading 11, 17, and Dante kept not explaining, and the space between them in the bed every morning kept feeling wider than physics could account for. The decision to follow him didn't feel dramatic when it happened. Felt inevitable, like a door she'd been leaning against for weeks had finally just given way. It was a Tuesday. She'd waited until she heard the elevator, then counted to 60, then went to the window that faced the building's private underground entrance. Dante's black SUV was already pulling out. She grabbed her coat off the hook by the door, not her good coat, the worn one she wore when she didn't want to look like she was trying, and took the stairs down to the parking level where she kept her own car, a nondescript dark blue sedan she'd owned since before she met Dante, before all of this. Kept 2 cars back. The streets were quiet enough at that hour that she had to be careful about it, had to let other cars filter between them at lights just to maintain cover. She was not a trained surveillance operative. She was a woman who'd watched enough procedural television to be dangerous and nothing more. She was aware, even then, of how she probably looked 34 years old, still in the apartment clothes she'd been wearing all evening, following her fiancé through the nighttime streets of Chicago, like some kind of cut-rate private investigator. She didn't care. She needed to know. The SUV took her west, then south, cutting through a neighborhood that sat at an uncomfortable in-between, not the kind of obvious wealth Dante usually moved through, not poor enough to feel dangerous, just quietly expensive in the way that old Chicago money sometimes was. Brownstones, iron railings, trees that had been there long enough to have opinions about the neighborhood. Dante's SUV stopped in front of one of them. Elena pulled over half a block back, cut her lights and watched. He sat in the car for maybe 2 minutes. She could see the dark shape of him behind the tinted glass, not moving. Then the driver's door opened. Dante drove himself on these trips. She noted, no security, no one else, and he got out carrying a small black case she'd never seen before. It was the kind of case that could hold anything: medical equipment, documents, cash. She couldn't tell from where she was, and that not knowing settled in her chest like a stone. There was a woman at the iron gate at the top of the brownstone's front steps. Elena saw her clearly enough, tall, dark-haired, dressed simply but not cheaply. The woman held the gate open for Dante, with the easy confidence of someone who had done it many times before. There was no embrace, no obvious affection, but there was familiarity, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. Dante went inside, the gate shut. Elena sat in her car for 11 minutes. She knew because she counted those, too. She went home before anything else happened, because sitting there was making her feel insane in a way that the driving had not. The city moved around her on the way back. She drove through green lights she barely registered. She made the turn into the parking garage on muscle memory alone. When she got back to the penthouse, Dante was still gone. She sat on the edge of the bed his side. She didn't know why and stared at the wall and tried to organize what she felt into something manageable. Couldn't. She thought about calling her sister in Cincinnati, but it was almost 1 a.m. and explaining the situation would require context she wasn't sure she could give without sounding like someone who'd made very poor choices. She thought about just waiting for Dante to come home and asking him directly, laying out everything she'd seen, demanding an answer. She thought about that for about 30 seconds before she acknowledged that Dante Moretti did not give answers on demand. It wasn't pride exactly. It was something more structural than that, something built into him at a level she'd never fully reached. No. If she was going to understand this, she was going to have to find it herself. The next morning, Dante was back in bed when she woke up. She hadn't heard him come in, and he looked at her over his coffee cup with the same measured attention he always gave her in the mornings. Quiet kind that used to feel like being valued and now felt like being studied. "You slept late," he said. "I didn't sleep well," she said. He nodded. He didn't ask why. She watched him over the rim of her own cup and thought, who are you, really? Not dramatically, not with tears building up behind it. Just the plain, flat question she'd started carrying around like a pebble in her shoe. Who are you in the parts of yourself you never let me see? She started with what she knew, which wasn't much. The woman at the gate, she'd only seen her for maybe 20 seconds under the amber glow of a streetlight. Dark hair. Yes, tall. Movement that suggested she was comfortable in her body. No fear in the way she'd held that gate. That last detail bothered Elena more than the others, somehow. Most people who had dealings with the Moretti family expressed at least some fear, even when they were trying to hide it. This woman had shown none. Elena spent her lunch break on her phone, trying search terms that felt absurd and yielded nothing. She didn't have a name. She had a street, a brownstone, a time of night, and a black case she couldn't identify. She went back to the brownstone the next afternoon, while Dante was in meetings and the sun was still up. She parked and walked past once, slowly, eyes forward, the way she'd read you were supposed to do. The brownstone looked ordinary, no nameplate by the gate. The curtains on the lower level were drawn. The building had its own entrance intercom, but she could see at least 2 additional security measures she wasn't supposed to be able to identify. And the fact that she could identify them, anyway, told her something important. Dante had taught her what to look for. In the early months of their relationship, on what she'd thought were just interesting educational tangents, he'd explained the language of controlled environments to her. She'd thought it was trust. Now she understood it differently. This place was locked down, not casually, deliberately. She went home and spent the evening behaving normally, which was one of the hardest things she'd ever done. She made dinner. She watched something on television she can't now remember. She answered a text from her coworker Bess about a project deadline. When Dante came into the room, she looked up and smiled and felt like a stranger inside her own expression. At 11:17, he left. She waited until midnight, then went into his office. She'd been in Dante's office before. Obviously, they lived together, and she wasn't excluded from any room in the penthouse on a regular basis. But the office had its own atmosphere, a kind of weight that made you instinctively lower your voice, even when you were alone in it. It was organized in the way that very controlled people organize things. Everything placed with intention, nothing accidental, nothing left out that wasn't supposed to be out. His desk was dark wood, old and solid, 2 monitors, a lamp, a glass ashtray he never used but also never moved that had been his father's. She didn't touch the desk first. She stood in the middle of the room and breathed and looked at everything from the center, trying to see it fresh, trying to see what she'd never looked at, because she'd had no reason to look. The filing cabinet behind the desk. She'd always assumed it was locked. When she tried the handle, it opened on the first pull, which was either careless or deliberate, and with Dante, it was never careless. The files were organized in hanging folders, labeled in the shorthand she recognized as his initials, abbreviated words. Most of it was business documentation. She could tell the shape of it without reading it, the particular density of legal and financial paperwork. But near the back, behind a red divider that had no label, she found something different. Photographs. A small stack of them, the real kind, printed on actual photographic paper. The top one showed a woman in a parking garage, taken from a distance, and at an angle clearly surveillance. The woman was young in the photo, late 20s maybe. Dark hair. She was carrying a ledger, the large bound kind, and the cover of it had something on it that was too dark to be a water stain. Elena's hands weren't completely steady when she turned to the next photograph. Same woman, closer this time. Inside what looked like a restaurant, across a table from a man Elena didn't recognize. The woman's face was half turned toward the camera, and something in her expression stopped Elena cold. Not fear, exactly, but the careful flatness of someone who was very afraid and very determined not to show it. The third photograph was the one that stayed with her. Showed the woman again, and this time her face was fully visible. Clearer. And Elena had the disorienting, vertigo-inducing experience of recognizing something she had no context for recognizing, because the woman in the photograph, older now, but unmistakably the same person, was the woman she'd seen holding open the iron gate at the Hutchinson Stone on the night she'd followed Dante. The same woman, the same measured composure. Here she was, years younger, clutching a blood-stained ledger in a parking garage in the middle of what was evidently not a routine Tuesday evening. Elena was so focused on the photographs that she didn't hear the office door open behind her. "You were never supposed to find her," she spun. Dante was standing in the doorway, coat still on. He must have come home early, or never fully left, she didn't know, couldn't reconstruct the timeline. His voice had been quiet, not explosive, not the controlled fury she'd braced herself for. Something worse than that, something almost hollow. She looked at him across the office, the photograph still in her hand, and her heartbeat was doing something unpleasant in her chest. But she made herself hold his gaze. She'd practiced being afraid of him, and she'd practiced not being afraid of him. And at this precise moment, what she felt was something outside either of those categories. She felt tired. She felt done with not knowing. "Then maybe you should have locked the cabinet," she said. Dante looked at the filing cabinet. His jaw shifted, the way it did when he was running calculations behind his face. He looked back at her. "Put them down, Elena. Tell me who she is." The silence between them lasted long enough to develop its own texture. Dante crossed the room, not fast, not aggressive, just deliberate, and she held her ground even though every physical instinct said to step back. He stopped at the edge of the desk, putting the wood between them, and finally took off his coat. Hung it over the chair. Another delay. Another controlled moment. "You followed me," he said. "You left me no other option." "That's not—" He stopped, pressed two fingers against the bridge of his nose, a gesture she'd seen him make before but rarely. "That's not why I said what I said. I'm not angry that you followed me." "You're not angry," she repeated, and she heard the flat disbelief in her own voice. "I'm scared," he said, and that landed between them like something thrown through glass, unexpected, jagged, impossible to pretend hadn't happened. Because Dante Moretti did not say words like that. In 2.5 years, she had heard him express irritation, satisfaction, occasionally something that approximated warmth. She had never heard him say he was scared. She set the photographs down on the desk. "Tell me the truth," she said. "All of it. Right now." He was quiet for another moment. He looked at the photographs on the desk, then at her, then at some middle distance that she couldn't reach. "Not tonight," he said. She almost laughed. "Dante, there are things that have to happen first, before I can tell you everything safely." He met her eyes again, and what was in his expression then was something she'd never catalogued before, not calculation, not the performance of calm. Something raw and cornered. "I need 3 more days." "Can you give me 3 more days?" She thought about the woman in the photographs with the blood-stained ledger. She thought about 19 nights of 11, 17 departures. She thought about herself, sitting on his side of the bed, staring at a wall. "2," she said, "and I want to go with you." Something crossed his face that she couldn't name. "You don't know what you're asking," he said. "Then explain it to me." He didn't answer that night. But he also didn't leave again. He was still there when the clock hit 11. 17, standing in his own kitchen, looking out the window at the city below, like he was trying to memorize something about it. Elena sat at the kitchen table and watched the back of his head and felt the night around them like a held breath. 2 days later, she was in the car beside him when he pulled up to the brownstone. He'd told her very little in the time between, just that the woman's name was Serena, that she was important, that Elena needed to keep what she was about to learn inside the walls of whatever this was. His voice, when he said it, had the quality of someone describing a structural element they couldn't afford to have failed. Elena had agreed to the terms without fully understanding them, because that was where she'd ended up, in a place where agreeing to partial information was the closest thing to progress available. The iron gate opened before Dante reached it. Serena was waiting, but this time in the lit doorway beyond, not at the gate itself. Up close, Elena could take her in properly mid-40s, sharp-featured, dark hair going silver at the temples in a way that looked deliberate rather than neglected. Her eyes moved to Elena immediately, the kind of assessment that happened in seconds and covered a lot of ground. Dante didn't introduce them right away. He went inside and Serena held the door, and Elena walked through it with the specific feeling of crossing a threshold she would not be able to uncross. The inside of the brownstone was not what she'd expected. It was lived in, but not comfortable, the kind of space organized around function rather than warmth. Stacks of documents on every surface, 2 laptops open on the dining table. A whiteboard against the far wall covered in names and arrows she couldn't read from where she stood. Serena closed the door behind them and put her back to it and looked at Elena with an expression that was something between apology and assessment. "You want to know the truth," Serena said. "Not a question." "That's why I'm here," Elena said. "Then sit down." Serena looked at Dante. "Both of you." There was something in her tone, not authority, exactly, but the specific weightlessness of someone who'd already lost everything once and no longer spent energy performing control. It was a different kind of composure than Dante's. His was built. Hers had been stripped to the bone, and what remained was what remained. Elena pulled out a chair and sat down. Dante stood beside the table, hands in his pockets, jaw set. He was watching Serena with something that Elena slowly, reluctantly, recognized as deference. Dante Moretti deferred to no one. She had understood that to be foundational to who he was. She was recalibrating everything in real time. "You found photographs," Serena said to Elena. "In his office." "Yes, then you've seen what I was carrying." Serena was quiet for a moment. "That ledger documented every bribe, every corruption payment, every deal my father ever made with the men who controlled the city's infrastructure. Police chiefs, judges, a deputy mayor. It documented all of it." She paused. "And I stole it when I was 29 years old, because I thought that was the only way to get out from under him." Elena looked at Dante. His expression hadn't changed. "Your father," Elena said slowly. "Carmine Moretti." Serena met her eyes. "My father," she confirmed, "which makes Dante my brother." She let that settle. Half-brother. His mother was not my mother. He didn't know I existed until 4 years ago. The room absorbed the silence that followed. Elena's mind was doing rapid structural work, rebuilding, rearranging, fitting pieces into places they hadn't been before. The visits, the black case, the absolute secrecy, the fear in Dante's voice when he said he was afraid. "Your father ordered her killed," Dante said. His voice was flat but not empty. "When he found out she'd taken the ledger, she had to disappear completely. 7 years ago." He looked at Elena. "What I carry in the case when I come here is medication. She has a condition that requires consistent management, and she can't go to a hospital. Can't go anywhere she might be recognized." Elena looked at the whiteboard. The names and arrows. "You're building a case against him," she said. "Against the men who still take his orders," Dante said. "My father is dying. The men beneath him are not." Serena's hands were folded on the table in front of her. She was watching Elena with that careful, stripped-down attention. "There's something else you need to know," Serena said. Dante's head moved slightly, a small, sharp motion. That might have been an attempt to stop her. "Someone has been feeding information about these meetings to people who want them stopped," Serena continued. "Someone who knows you, someone close to both of you." Elena felt it then, not the dramatic crash of revelation, but the specific physical sensation of a floor becoming untrustworthy beneath her feet. The kind of fear that starts in the stomach. "Who?" she said. Neither of them answered immediately. The 2 laptops hummed on the table. Outside, somewhere down the block, a car passed with its bass turned up loud, the sound rippling through the walls and then fading. Serena looked at her. "That's what we're trying to find out," she said. "Before they find us first." Then every light in the building went out at once. In the sudden darkness, Elena heard Dante move, heard the specific focused motion of a man who had anticipated this, and his hand found her arm in the black, closed around it, and pulled. "Don't make a sound," he said directly into her ear. His voice was almost nothing, just breath-shaped into words. "Don't move until I say." She could hear something outside. Not the car with the bass, not traffic, something deliberate. Footsteps, more than 2 pairs of them, moving through the silence with the particular rhythm of people who've done whatever comes next before. Elena sat in the dark inside a brownstone in a West Chicago neighborhood, next to a woman she'd known for 14 minutes, and understood that the answer to the question she'd been asking for 6 weeks was not what she'd imagined. It was worse, and it was larger, and it was already in motion around her. And the man she was about to marry was standing somewhere in the room, in the dark. calculating their odds. The darkness inside the brownstone was not the ordinary kind. It had weight to it, texture. The kind of dark that arrives with intention rather than accident, that settles over a room and tells you, in the specific language of your own nervous system, that something outside the window has made a decision about you. Elena didn't move. She'd stopped breathing somewhere around the moment Dante's hand found her arm, and now she was doing a shallow, controlled thing that wasn't quite breathing, just the minimum exchange of air required to stay conscious. Her heart was very loud. She was aware of the grain of the chair beneath her palms, the slight rough edge where the wood had been worn down unevenly, and she focused on that texture because it was real and immediate, and everything else was dark and uncertain. Dante had moved away from her. She'd felt him go, the warmth of him pulling back, his hand releasing her arm with a deliberateness that said, "I'm not abandoning you. I'm positioning," and now she could only track him by sound. He made very little of it. A shift of weight, a soft friction that might have been fabric against a wall. Serena was completely silent on the other side of the table. Outside, the footsteps had stopped. That was worse than if they'd continued. Elena counted seconds in her head because it was something to do, because the counting imposed a structure on the dark that the dark itself refused to provide. She got to 23 before she heard Serena's voice, barely above nothing, reaching across the space between them. "Back wall, there's a door." Elena didn't respond. She wasn't sure she was supposed to. A new sound now from outside, not footsteps, but something lower. A radio, maybe. A communication device cycling through static. One burst, then silence, then a second burst with a short pattern she couldn't decode. Dante's voice came from her left, closer than she'd expected. "There are 3 of them on the front. I don't know the back yet." A pause. "Serena, I know." Serena's voice came from somewhere Elena hadn't tracked. She'd moved without sound, which meant she'd done it before, which meant she'd thought about this room in exactly these terms before. "The drive is in the panel behind the whiteboard. If we have to leave without it." "We're not leaving without it, Dante." The flatness in Serena's voice was the kind that comes from having had an argument enough times to be bored by it. "If we have to leave without it, the copies are with Hargrove. You know that. Hargrove's already compromised." A beat of silence that carried more information than most full sentences Elena had ever heard. "Since," Serena said. "Since 3 days ago. I didn't want to tell you until I was certain." Quality of Serena's silence changed. Elena could feel it, even in the dark, even without being able to see her face. It was the silence of someone recalculating every decision they'd made in recent memory, and finding the math has been wrong throughout. "Then we're more exposed than I thought," Serena said finally. Her voice was still flat, still controlled, but something underneath it had shifted, thinned. "Yes." Elena's eyes had begun adjusting. Not to full visibility, there wasn't enough ambient light for that, but to shapes. The dark rectangle of the back wall, the pale oblong of the whiteboard. The seated mass of what she now understood was Serena, 2 chairs down. She made herself think clearly, or she tried to. "The people outside," she said, keeping her voice at the same near-nothing level the others had used. "Do they know I'm here?" Dante was quiet for 2 seconds. "Probably not. My route here was clean." "They followed you before," Elena said. "Not tonight. They had advance information about the location itself." Another silence. This one had a different weight. "She's right," Serena said. "I know she's right," Dante said. "Then someone told them about this place specifically. Not just that you were meeting someone." Elena pressed her palms flat against the table and made herself breathe evenly. "Which means your surveillance of your own people has a gap." Dante didn't answer that. She took his silence as confirmation. What happened next happened in the compressed, slightly unreal way that high adrenaline moments always work, not slow motion, the way people describe, but hypersequential. Each second producing more sensory data than could be fully processed in real time, the understanding arriving slightly after the events themselves. A sound at the side of the building, then a beam of light across the front windows, moving slow and deliberate. Serena was already moving before Elena fully registered it up from her chair, no wasted motion, crossing to the whiteboard. In the brief sweep of outside light, Elena caught one clear image, Serena's hands working a seam in the wall behind the whiteboard, fingers finding the edge of a panel that had no visible handle. Dante was beside Elena now. Up, he said, quiet and non-negotiable. She got up. The panel came free with a soft pop. Serena reached into the darkness behind it and came out with a thin hard drive, roughly the size of a paperback book. She put it inside her jacket without looking at it, the motion of someone who has practiced it. Door, she said. Single file. No lights until we're clear of the building. They moved. The back hallway was narrow and smelled like old wood and something chemical Elena couldn't identify. Serena led. Elena followed. Dante came last, and she could hear in the quality of his movement behind her that he was tracking what was happening at the front of the building simultaneously, dividing his attention between the threat ahead and the threat behind in a way that should have been impossible and apparently wasn't. The back door opened onto a small enclosed yard with a wooden fence. Beyond the fence, an alley. Serena went over the fence first, with an efficiency that surprised Elena and then, half a second later, didn't. She was a woman who'd spent 7 years invisible in a city full of people looking for her. She'd learned things about moving through the world undetected that most people would never need. Elena went next. The fence was about shoulder height. She got both hands on top of it, pushed herself up, swung her legs over, dropped into the alley with a landing that jarred through her knees and up into her hips. Behind her, Dante came over in one motion, quiet. They moved down the alley at the edge of running without quite breaking into it, the pace that eats distance, without generating the attention that full running creates. Serena turned twice without hesitation, navigating a geography she clearly knew. Elena focused on keeping up and not twisting an ankle on the uneven pavement. 2 blocks later, they stopped in the shadow of a loading dock. All 3 of them breathing harder than they'd like. Elena looked at Dante. Even in the inadequate light of the alley, she could read the tension in his face, the way it had settled into something harder and more compressed than usual. There was a cut on his left hand that she hadn't noticed before, maybe from the fence, maybe earlier, and the dark thread of it across his palm made something twist in her chest that she didn't have time for right now. "Where are we going?" she said. "I have a place," he said. 20 minutes from here. No one knows about it." She almost said something, caught herself. Because the thing she'd almost said was, "Is that still true, though?" And the reason she'd almost said it was because of what they'd been discussing inside the brown stone, before the lights went out, the question of who was feeding information to the people who wanted Serena dead and Dante's. Quiet operation finished before it could conclude. Someone close to both of them. She filed that thought somewhere she could reach it later and focused on moving. The drive to the secondary location was in Serena's car, which had been parked 2 streets over, not outside the brownstone, never directly outside. Because Serena had been living with the understanding that her proximity to any location could make that location dangerous. Elena rode in the back seat. She noticed things by reflex, the registration slip on the dash, which named a woman she didn't recognize, an insurance card with the same name, a gym bag on the floor that held things she couldn't see. She was cataloging details to give herself something to do with her hands and her mind, instead of thinking about what she was thinking about. The place Dante had referenced turned out to be a ground floor unit in an unremarkable apartment building in a neighborhood that specialized in unremarkable apartment buildings. The hallway smelled like institutional carpet cleaner. The unit itself was sparse in the way that temporary spaces are sparse: a table, chairs, a couch that looked like it had come with the place, blackout curtains on every window. There was a second laptop on the table and a phone she didn't recognize, and a box of files that someone had clearly been working through recently. Serena went to the kitchen. Elena heard water running. She stood in the middle of the space and looked at Dante, who was already checking the windows, not obviously, not throwing back the curtains, just touching the edges, confirming the seals. Small methodical safety audit of someone who'd survived by paying attention to small methodical things. "Talk to me," Elena said. Dante let the curtain drop. Turned. "I told you this wasn't something I could explain quickly." "That was 2 days ago," she said. "We're past quick!" "I want the full version now." He looked at her for a moment, not calculating, not performing calm. Looking. Then he moved to the table and sat down, and she sat across from him, and he told her. The account took nearly an hour. It wasn't smooth or rehearsed. He backtracked twice, corrected himself once on a date, stopped entirely at one point to stare at the table for a full 30 seconds before continuing. She recognized the shape of truth in the telling of it, not the clean, organized version, but the actual version, which has redundancies and gaps, and the particular weight of things a person has been carrying for too long. He'd found out about Serena 4 years ago. Not through family disclosure, Carmine Moretti had never mentioned a daughter from his first relationship, which had ended before Dante was born, and which Carmine had apparently worked to erase from the record of his personal history. Dante had found out through a ledger entry, a payment, recurring, quarterly, to an account that resolved to a woman named Serena Vale, which was not a name Carmine Moretti had ever said in Dante's presence. Dante had investigated quietly, the way he did everything, methodically, without announcing the investigation, following threads until they led somewhere definitive. What they led to was a dead end, literally a death certificate from 7 years ago, filed in a county 2 states away, for a Serena Moretti, age 39. Cause of death listed as cardiac event. The certificate was a professional-grade fabrication. It had taken Dante another 8 months to confirm that. He'd found her through the ledger she'd taken. The same ledger that appeared in the surveillance photographs Elena had found in his office. Because the ledger was the thing that had saved Serena's life, even as it endangered it, she'd offered it as leverage, through an intermediary, to a federal contact she'd developed during her years working inside the Moretti organization's legal front operations. The contact was the thing keeping her alive. The ledger was the proof that made the contact worth maintaining. But the ledger alone wasn't enough. It documented Carmine's corruption, yes, but Carmine was dying, and prosecution of a dying man was not the federal contact's primary interest. What the contact wanted was the network beneath Carmine, the men who'd been using the Moretti infrastructure as a vehicle for their own operations. Men whose money ran through city contracts and zoning decisions, and the kind of structural corruption that doesn't end when one old man stops breathing. That was what Dante had been building toward. That was what the nighttime visits were, not romantic, not conspiratorial in the way Elena had feared. He was delivering documentation. He was verifying evidence chains. He was acting as the bridge between Serena's survival and the conclusion of something that had been constructed painstakingly over 4 years. And someone had been watching him do it. Elena sat with all of this for a while after he finished talking. Serena had come back from the kitchen at some point during the telling, taken a chair in the corner, said nothing. The second laptop was open, but the screen had gone to sleep. Who knew about Serena? Elena said finally. Inside your organization. Who had enough access to have figured it out? Victor Kane, Serena said from the corner. Her voice had the flat quality again, the one that lived beneath the control. He was with Carmine for 30 years. He built half the financial structures we're currently documenting. Victor would have had access to the same payment records I found, Dante said. If he was looking for inconsistencies in the books during the succession process after my father got sick, he would have found the quarterly payments, Elena said. Yes, and Victor knows you. He'd know that if you discovered Serena was alive, you'd protect her. Dante looked at her. Yes, she thought about Victor Kane. She'd met him a dozen times at dinners, at 2 events she'd attended with Dante, once at the penthouse when she'd come home unexpectedly, and found him and Dante talking in the kitchen in low voices that stopped when she appeared. Victor was 70, maybe 72. Silver hair, impeccably maintained. He had the social grace of someone who'd spent decades in rooms full of powerful people and had learned to make every person in a room feel like the most considered person in it. He'd always been warm to her, specifically, particularly warm, in the way that, now that she was thinking about it, felt less like genuine regard and more like management. She'd been managed by Victor Kane. She'd attributed it to the affability of an old family man, and it had actually been information control. She felt something cold move through her that wasn't quite anger yet. It was the precursor to anger, the understanding that precedes the feeling. You suspected him, she said. Before tonight. Dante didn't look away. I had a reason to suspect him. I didn't have confirmation. And you didn't tell me. No. Even when someone in your circle was leaking information that could get Serena killed. She kept her voice level. She was proud of that in a distant way, even when that person might have access to me, to our home. Dante's jaw moved. That's not the same. Victor has been to our penthouse, Dante. He has been in our home. If he's the source of the leak, Then he's been gathering intelligence on everything, including me, including my movements, including what I might or might not know. You weren't in danger. You don't get to make that assessment without telling me the information, she said. And now there was something in her voice that she hadn't entirely intended, not loud, not performative, just solid. Kind of solid that comes after a person has processed fear and come out on the other side of it with something harder. You made a choice about what I was allowed to know to protect myself, and I'm telling you that was not your choice to make. Dante was quiet. Serena was very still in the corner. She's right, Serena said, for the second time that night. I know, Dante said, for the second time. His voice was lower now. I know she's right, then why, Elena said. Not accusatory. A genuine question. He exhaled, looked at his hands. Because telling you would have meant explaining, Serena. And I wasn't ready to do that until she agreed to it. He looked up. She had the right to decide who knew she was alive. I wasn't going to take that from her. Elena looked at Serena, who was watching her with that direct, unbothered assessment. And you're telling me now, Elena said to her. Circumstances changed, Serena said simply. They slept in the apartment that night, all three of them, which was an awkward and entirely practical arrangement. Elena took the couch. She didn't sleep. She lay in the dark and listened to the building and thought about Victor Kane and thought about the 6 weeks of midnight departures and thought about herself at 19, telling her mother that she was a good judge of character, and her mother saying, "You're a good judge of people who let you judge them." She'd never really understood that until right now. In the morning, Serena made coffee and brought it to the table, and the three of them sat there with the particular careful atmosphere of people who have been through something together and are now negotiating the next phase. If Victor is the source, Elena said, wrapping both hands around her mug, he's going to know last night went wrong. The people he sent didn't get what they were looking for. He'll recalculate, Dante said. He'll move faster, Elena said. He's had 30 years with your family, which means he knows how you think. He knows that once you suspect him, you won't stop. He knows the timeline just compressed. Serena was looking at Elena with an expression she hadn't worn before, less assessment, more something that was almost like recognition. What would he do, Serena said, if he wanted to slow you down? Both of you. What's the pressure point? Elena thought about it. Not for long. He'd go after the evidence chain, she said. Not the people. He can't go after the people openly without exposing himself. But if the evidence chain breaks, Hargrove, Dante said. Elena looked at him. You said Hargrove was already compromised. I said I had reason to believe. I don't have confirmation there either. He set down his cup. I need to verify Hargrove's status today. If he's been turned, then there's no external backup for what's on that drive, Serena said. She touched her jacket where the hard drive was. And Victor knows that, Elena said. The morning had taken on a very specific quality. She'd felt something similar once before. During a bad situation in her early 20s, she didn't think about often the feeling of standing in a current that is stronger than your preference, being moved in a direction by forces that don't care whether you're ready. You can struggle or you can swim, but what you can't do is pretend the current isn't there. She was done pretending. While Dante was on the phone with the first of several contacts he needed to reach before noon, Elena sat with Serena and talked. Not about the operation, not about evidence and federal contacts. Just talked. The way two people do when they've been thrown into the same difficult water and are treading beside each other. Serena had been 29 when she left Chicago. She'd spent 2 years before that inside her father's organization in a capacity that Carmine had considered an administrative, and Serena had been using as an intelligence-gathering operation. She'd always known, she said, that she was never going to inherit anything and never going to be acknowledged. She'd made her peace with that. What she hadn't made peace with was what she'd watched being done, the breadth of the corruption, the specific people who'd had their lives dismantled by the Moretti Network's arrangements. The ledger wasn't about bringing him down, Serena said. Not at first. It was about proof that I'd seen it, that it was real. She turned her coffee cup slowly between her hands. When you spend years watching something terrible happen and being the only person in the room who seems bothered by it, you start to question your own perception. You need something outside yourself, something that doesn't depend on your memory to be real. Elena understood that in a way she wasn't ready to articulate. Are you safe here? She asked instead. Safer than I was at the brownstone. Serena's mouth curved slightly, which is a low bar. How long have you been living like this? 7 years. Elena looked at her, the silver at her temples. The particular way she held herself, that economy of movement that wasn't taught in any class, but came from a very long time of making yourself small enough to stay alive. You could have run, Elena said. Left Chicago entirely. Could have. Serena set down the cup. I didn't want to. I wanted it to be over. Not just survivable over. She looked at Elena directly. That's the difference. Surviving is not the same as finishing. I was tired of surviving. Elena thought about that for the rest of the morning. She thought about it while Dante made calls in the back room, with the door mostly closed, and she could hear his voice in low bursts through the wall, controlled and terse. She thought about it while she washed her face in the bathroom and looked at herself in the mirror and acknowledged that she looked like someone who hadn't slept and had spent part of the night running through alleys in the wrong shoes. Dante came out of the back room at 11:15 with an expression that had moved past, controlled into something that was almost its opposite, not chaotic, but stripped. Like the control had been surgically removed to reveal what it had been sitting on top of. Hargrove is gone, he said. He cleared out his office last night. His phone's been disconnected. Serena closed her eyes for 2 seconds. Opened them, so the copies he was holding, Elena began. Gone or in Victor's hands, one or the other. Dante moved to the table, put both palms flat on it, and stared at the surface. The only complete copy of the documented evidence chain is on that drive. The three of them looked at each other. Elena spoke first. Victor will know Hargrove has run. He'll know we know. Which means he'll move today, not tomorrow, not next week. Today he'll go to the organization first, Dante said. Rally the people who are still loyal to the old order. Position it as a security issue. Can he do that? Elena said. Do people still take his direction? Dante's jaw worked. Yes. Victor has been the operational continuity for 3 years while my father's been sick. He has relationships I haven't been able to fully map. So he calls a meeting, Elena said. Positions it as cleanup. And then what he comes after the drive directly. Or he comes after me, Serena said quietly, and the drive becomes irrelevant. The room went very still. Elena looked at Serena. Serena was looking at the window with the blackout curtain, looking at nothing visible, her face doing the thing it did when she was running calculations. Then we don't wait for him to move first, Elena said. Both of them looked at her. We know who it is. We have the evidence on the drive. We have the federal contact. The federal contact needs the complete documentation, Dante said. The drive alone isn't sufficient without the chain of custody verification. But it's enough to initiate contact, enough to put the process in motion officially, so there's a record of it existing outside this room. She looked at Dante. Once it's in federal hands, even incomplete, Victor's leverage disappears. He can't suppress it. He can't intercept it. Dante was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen before. Not surprise, exactly. Something more complicated. The federal contact is Serena's relationship, he said. Then Serena makes the call, Elena said. She looked at Serena. Today Serena was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the drive sitting on the table, then at Elena. If I make that call, she said slowly, it's not reversible. Once that contact is officially activated, everyone connected to the organization will know there's a live federal operation. Victor will know. The people who've been waiting to see which way this breaks will have to choose a side. Yes, Elena said. Dante's position inside the organizations becomes relevant, Dante said. His voice had something new in it. Not resignation. Something that sounded almost like relief. If we're doing this, we're doing it all the way. There's no managed middle ground anymore. Serena looked at him, then at Elena. You understand what you're asking for, Serena said to Elena. This isn't just about exposing Victor. If this goes forward today, the entire Moretti operation comes under federal review. Everything. All of it I know, Elena said. It ends Dante's position. His legitimate business holdings will be scrutinized. His ability to operate in the city in any capacity that relies on the family name. I know, Elena said again. And she looked at Dante when she said it. Not asking. Just making sure he saw that she understood the weight of what she was proposing, and was proposing it anyway. Dante held her gaze for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and picked up the drive. He held it out to Serena. Serena took it. She looked at it in her hand, the object she'd been protecting for 7 years, the thing her invisibility had been purchased with, the proof that the world she'd come from was as ugly as she'd always known it was. She got up and went to the back room to make the call. The door didn't quite close behind her. Through the gap, Elena could hear her voice, not the words, just the tone. Measured, clear, the voice of someone who had decided. Elena sat at the table across from Dante. Neither of them spoke. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, his cut palm rough against her knuckles. Turned her hand over and held his. Through the wall, Serena kept talking. Outside, Chicago moved through its morning, indifferent and enormous and entirely unaware that something was being set in motion inside this ordinary apartment in this ordinary building that could not now be stopped. Elena felt the current. She didn't fight it. This time she swam. Serena was on the phone for 19 minutes. Elena knew because she watched the clock on the microwave across the kitchen, the green digits marking time with the indifference of machines, while Dante sat across from her, and neither of them spoke, and the apartment held its breath around them. 19 minutes. She'd expected longer. She'd expected the kind of negotiation that takes hours, the careful back and forth of people managing high-stakes information through layers of caution and protocol. 19 minutes felt both too short and too long, depending on which part of her was doing the feeling. When Serena came back through the door, her face told Elena nothing immediately useful. She moved to the table, set the drive down in the center of it, and sat. Done, she said. Dante looked up. Reyes agreed to the terms? Reyes is gone, Serena said. Transferred 8 months ago. The contact is someone new, a woman named Castillo. She paused. She knew about the operation. She had the file. Reyes briefed her before he left. You trust her, Dante said. Not a question, exactly. More like a boundary he was drawing around the fact, so he could examine its edges. I don't trust anyone, Serena said, but she has institutional knowledge she couldn't have manufactured, and she didn't flinch when I gave her Victor's name. She folded her hands on the table. She wants a formal meeting. Physical handoff of the drive and the supporting documentation. When Elena said, 48 hours, Serena looked at the drive. She needs to prepare her team and establish a secure channel through the field office. She said 48 hours was the minimum she could responsibly offer. Elena did the math she didn't want to do. 48 hours was 2 days. 2 days during which Victor Kane would be operating with the knowledge that something had gone wrong at the brownstone. 2 days during which Hargrove was in the wind, and the organization was restless, and the people who'd built their positions on the assumption of Moretti continuity were going to be making decisions about their own survival. 2 days was a long time. We stay here, Dante said. It wasn't a proposal. We can't stay here for 2 days, Serena said. This location was on my list of contingency sites. Victor may not have it, but Hargrove did. If Hargrove gave Victor everything, then we have maybe 12 hours before this location is compromised, Dante finished. Elena looked at the box of files on the side table. What's in there? Supporting documentation, Serena said. Hard copies of financial records, correspondence. The drive has the primary evidence, but the physical files provide context and verification. Can we photograph it? Digitize it? Serena and Dante both looked at her. We have 2 laptops, Elena said. If we can get the contents of those files into a format that can be transmitted independently of the drive, then even if the drive is compromised, Castillo has something to work with. Serena was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at Dante with an expression that said something Elena wasn't fluent enough in their specific shorthand to translate. Start with the financial records, Serena said to Elena. The correspondence can wait. The financial chain is what Castillo's team will build the initial case around. They worked through the morning and into the afternoon. Elena photographed pages with Serena's phone while Serena organized, and Dante worked the laptops, compressing files and establishing the encrypted transmission pathway that the Castillo contact had provided. It was methodical, unglamorous work, the kind that made her hands cramp and her eyes blur and her back ache from bending over the table. She didn't complain. Nobody complained. They worked in the efficient silence of people who understand that the work itself is the thing keeping the walls up. At one point, Dante brought her water without being asked, set it beside her elbow without comment, and went back to what he was doing. She drank it without looking up. It was possibly the most purely intimate gesture she'd witnessed from him in 6 weeks, and it arrived in the middle of a documentation sprint in a safe-house apartment with blackout curtains. She noted this with the distant part of her brain that was always cataloging. They broke at 2 in the afternoon because Serena said they had to, because nobody had eaten and people make poor decisions on empty systems. Dante went 3 blocks to a diner and came back with food in paper bags, the kind of diner that doesn't write anything down and has been in the same location since the 1970s, and whose staff have seen enough of the city's human variety to have developed a professional incuriosity about their customers. Elena ate without tasting. A sandwich, she thought. The eggs. Something with bread. It was during the meal that her phone buzzed. She almost ignored it. She'd put it on the table, face down, at the start of the morning work session, because she didn't want the distraction. When she turned it over, the notification was a text from a number she didn't recognize. Not a contact. Just a number, Chicago area code, and a message that was 8 words long. You need to see what's in his safe. Elena stared at the screen. Dante was looking at her. He'd caught the change in her face before she'd arranged it into something neutral, because Dante Moretti had spent his entire life reading faces for survival, and hers was apparently not difficult. What is it? He said. She turned the phone and slid it across the table toward him. He read it. She watched his face and saw nothing move in it, which told her the nothing was deliberate. You recognize the number? She said. No, but you're not surprised. He looked up from the phone. The pause before he spoke was 3 seconds too long. I don't know who sent that, he said. That's not what I asked. Serena had put down her fork. She was watching them both. Dante, Elena said, is there something in your safe that I need to know about? The silence this time had a different architecture. Not the silence of calculation, not the silence of a controlled man managing information. Something older and more uncomfortable. The silence of someone who has been keeping a thing in a room they hoped would never be opened, and is now watching someone else's hand on the door. There's a safe in the penthouse, he said. In the office. Behind the painting over the secondary bookcase. I know where the safe is, Elena said. You showed me the combination when we moved in. You said it contained documentation I might need in an emergency. Yes, what else is in it? He picked up the phone. Looked at it again, as though the text message might have changed in the last 30 seconds. Set it back down. Letters, he said. The word landed with a flatness that was disproportionate to its size. Letters, Elena repeated. From Victor. He exhaled through his nose. Written before I found Serena. Before I understood what he was. He looked at the table. I was 26 when my father started getting sick, and Victor became the primary voice of operational guidance. He was everything I'd been taught to respect: loyal, experienced, strategic. He mentored me. Those letters are from that period. Personal. A pause. They're also evidential. Elena heard the word and felt something click into place with the unpleasant mechanical precision of a trap closing. Evidential, she said. Of what? He looked at her. His eyes were steady in the way that means a person is making themselves be steady, the visible effort underneath the surface calm. There are 2 letters in particular, he said, where Victor lays out a plan for managing the succession, for maintaining the organization's structure after my father dies. He stopped. Plan includes contingencies for eliminating threats to that structure. Threats like Serena, Elena said. The letters predate my knowledge of Serena's existence. Victor wrote about a threat to organizational continuity. He used that phrase, not a name. I didn't understand what he was referring to at the time. I understand now. He looked at Serena. He knew about you before I did. He's known for years. Serena's face did something very small and very controlled. Compression around the eyes. A slight shift of her jaw. Elena recognized it as the expression of someone absorbing information they'd intellectually expected and emotionally hadn't. And the letters are in your safe, Serena said. Her voice was not entirely flat this time. Yes. In the penthouse. Yes. Serena set her hands on the table, palms down, and was quiet for a moment. Then, how long have you known that Victor knew about me? 3 weeks, Dante said. The silence that followed was different from all the previous silences. It had a temperature. 3 weeks, Serena said. I needed to verify. You needed to verify, she repeated. and now the flatness was gone entirely, replaced by something that had been waiting underneath it. You found out 3 weeks ago that the man who has been trying to have me killed for 7 years knew exactly who I was and where to find me, and you continued bringing me medication on a schedule, on the same route, at the same time, to the same location. I varied the routes, Dante. Her voice cut clean through his sentence. You continued operating as though the threat level hadn't changed. You made that choice without telling me. She looked at him, and what was in her face was not the carefully managed composure of the last 18 hours, but something underneath it, older and rawer. I have been living in that brownstone for 14 months. I have been trusting your security assessments of that location for 14 months. And for the last 3 weeks, you knew we were more exposed than you had told me, and you said nothing. Dante didn't look away from her. He took what she was saying in the full, which Elena recognized as something he was doing with effort. I made a mistake, he said. Yes, Serena said, you did. Elena thought about the text message, the unknown number. You need to see what's in his safe. Someone knows about the letters, she said. Someone who knows they're in the penthouse and what they contain. She looked at Dante. Who else knew about the safe's contents? No one. It's not I've never discussed the contents with anyone. Victor himself? Dante was quiet. Victor doesn't know I kept them. He sent them through a private channel years ago. He would assume I destroyed them after reading, because that's what he would have done. But you kept them. I kept everything. His voice had a quiet weight. I have kept documentation of everything since I was 24 years old because I grew up in a family where the only protection against being destroyed by the people around you was having proof of what they'd done. It was survival behavior. I didn't know at the time that I'd need those specific letters for this specific purpose. Elena looked at her phone. The text message, still on the screen. Someone sent this to warn me, she said, or to move me. Get me back to the penthouse. She looked up, which could be a genuine warning, or it could be Victor trying to separate us. The timing, Serena said. This arrives the morning after the call to Castillo. Victor doesn't know about the call, Dante said. We don't know what Victor knows, Elena said, and the sentence came out flat and certain in a way that silenced the room. She was right, and they both knew it. The entire morning's work had been built on the assumption that they had some informational advantage over Victor Kane, that his visibility into their operation had limits they could identify and manage. The text message was a reminder that they didn't actually know the shape of what he knew. Picked up her phone. I'm going to the penthouse. No, Dante said. Immediately. No space before it. Those letters are evidence, if Victor knows they exist. If Victor is trying to get you back to that building, walking back into it is exactly what he wants. If he wanted to move against me directly, he's had 6 weeks of opportunity. Elena met Dante's eyes. He hasn't, because I'm not the target. The operation is the target. The drive is the target. I'm incidental. You followed me to the brownstone. You're in that building when it was surveilled. You're not incidental anymore. Then we can't leave the letters where they are. If Victor finds them before Castillo's meeting. I'll go, Dante said. You can't go back there, Serena said. You're the one Victor actually wants to locate. The three of them sat with the architecture of the problem. Elena could see Dante doing the calculation, working through scenarios with the contained speed of someone who'd been making these assessments his entire adult life. She could also see the exact moment he landed on the conclusion she'd already reached, because something in his face shifted by a degree. You go in and out, he said. 40 minutes maximum. You take nothing from the apartment except those 2 letters. You don't access anything else in the safe. You don't engage with anyone in the building. You don't... Dante, she said. I understand. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he wrote the safe combination on a slip of paper, though she already knew it, and handed it to her with the particular careful motion of someone who is trusting a person with something they're not fully comfortable in trusting. She drove to the penthouse in Serena's car, which had different plates than the car she'd left there 2 nights ago. The city moved around her in its ordinary afternoon rhythm traffic, pedestrians, the specific layered noise of a city that doesn't pause for any individual's crisis. She found a parking spot 2 blocks from the building and walked the rest, shoulders level, pace deliberate, the worn coat she'd grabbed the night. She followed Dante doing its work of making her look unremarkable. Building's lobby was quiet. The doorman Paulson, nodded at her with his usual courtesy, and she nodded back and took the elevator up with the controlled stillness of someone who has nothing unusual on her mind. She watched the floor numbers increase and breathed, and said nothing to herself inside her head because there was nothing useful to say. Penthouse was exactly as she'd left it 2 nights ago. Half-eaten sandwich gone the cleaning service had been, which meant it was either Wednesday or Thursday she'd lost track. Kitchen was clean. The living room was undisturbed. She moved through it without turning on lights, using the afternoon gray coming through the windows. The office, the painting. She knew the safe's location precisely, and she moved to it with a directness that would have looked, to any observer, like someone who'd been there before and knew where they were going. The painting came away from the wall, on its hinges a modified frame Dante had installed. She'd always thought it was slightly absurd, the kind of thing that belongs in a film, and exposed the safe face. She entered the combination. The door swung open, inside stacked folders. A sealed envelope she recognized as the emergency documentation Dante had referenced when he'd first shown it to her. A small box whose contents she'd never inquired about. And in the back, held together with a rubber band, a stack of envelopes. Counted 7. She took the stack out and fanned through them until she found the 2 Dante had described. She identified them by the dates on the outside, cross-referencing against the 3-week window he'd mentioned for, when he said his understanding of Victor had shifted. She had them in her hand and was turning to go when she saw the other folder. It was behind where the envelope stack had been. She'd have missed it if she hadn't set the other materials aside, in order to retrieve the letters cleanly. It was a plain manila folder, the kind that costs nothing and says nothing about itself, with 2 initials written on the tab in Dante's hand. EV, her initials. She stood in the office in the afternoon light and felt the floor become uncertain again. She opened it. Inside was a photograph, then another. Then a printed email chain, 12 pages. The earliest message dated 14 months ago, 4 months before she and Dante had gotten engaged, 6 months before he'd proposed. The email chain was between Dante and a name she didn't recognize, an address she couldn't identify, and it discussed her. Elena Voss, specifically, her nonprofit work, her background, her family, her financial situation, her psychological profile, assembled from sources she couldn't immediately identify. There was a phrase in the 5th email that she read 3 times, because the first 2 times she thought she must be parsing it wrong. Confirm she is appropriate for the long-term containment role. Full emotional integration preferred. She was aware of her own breathing. Aware of her hands, which were not entirely steady. Aware of the folder in those hands and the afternoon light and the city outside the window, going about its indifferent business. Kept reading. There were assessments, progress reports, dates that corresponded to events she remembered from her relationship with Dante, their first dinner, a weekend trip they'd taken, the night he'd told her he loved her. Each event documented, each event evaluated for what it produced in terms of her attachment, her trust, her emotional integration. The last email in the chain was 11 months ago, and it said, "Integration complete. Recommend proceeding to proposal phase." Elena closed the folder. She stood in Dante's office with his letters in one hand and her own file in the other, and she understood several things simultaneously, the understanding arriving not sequentially, but all at once. The way a structural collapse happens, not one thing after another, but everything at the same time. She understood that she had been selected. Not found, not chosen in the romantic sense she'd once briefly doubted and then accepted. Selected the way an operational asset is selected. For her psychology, her background, her lack of connection to the Moretti world, her fundamental outsideness, all the things she'd thought made her an unlikely choice for someone like Dante had been exactly the things that made her useful. She understood that the folder and its contents predated Dante's discovery of Serena, predated the operation against Victor, predated everything she'd told herself was the real story underneath the story. She understood that she did not know which version of what she'd experienced with Dante was real, if any of it was. If the man who drove 40 minutes in a snowstorm to bring her ibuprofen had done it because he wanted to, or because the integration report had flagged emotional reinforcement behaviors as recommended at that phase. She stood there for what was probably 90 seconds, but felt like considerably longer. Then she put both folders under her arm and left the office and walked to the elevator and went back down through the lobby, nodding at Paulson again, and walked the 2 blocks to the car in the afternoon city air and got in and sat. She didn't drive immediately. She put the folders on the passenger seat and put her hands on the wheel at 10 and 2 and stared at the street ahead and breathed with a deliberateness that had nothing to do with calm and everything to do with keeping the breathing from stopping. Then she drove back. She said nothing when she came through the door. She set the letters on the table in front of Dante and dropped the manila folder beside them and stepped back. He looked at the folder. She watched his face and saw the moment he recognized it, saw the recognition move through him, and then watched him go completely, deliberately still in the way of someone containing a large amount of something. "Don't explain it yet," she said. Her voice was flat and even and came from a place in her that had gone past the initial shock and was now operating on some cleaner, colder fuel. "I need you to look at me first." He looked at her. "Did you select me?" she said. The silence lasted 4 seconds. "Yes," he said. Serena, across the room, went very still. "Was any of it real?" Elena said. He opened his mouth. She watched something move through his face, not calculation, not management, but something more disorganized than that. Something she would have recognized as distress in a person she still trusted. "All of it was real," he said. "That's not possible," she said. "Both of those things cannot be simultaneously true." "I know how it looks. I need you to understand something," she said, and she heard her own voice change on that sentence, drop slightly, shed whatever last layer of performance had been left in it. "I have given you the last 2.5 years of my life. I followed you through alleys in the dark. I sat in a car outside a brownstone counting minutes. I watched you tell me you were scared, and I believed it was the most honest thing you'd ever said to me." She stopped, swallowed. "And now I'm standing here holding a document that says I was a long-term containment role who needed full emotional integration before you could move to the proposal phase. So I need you to understand that when I ask if any of it was real, I am not asking a rhetorical question. I am asking you the only question that matters to me right now." Dante was looking at her with something in his face she'd never mapped before. Couldn't name it. She couldn't tell if she was reading it accurately anymore, because the file had done something to her interpretive framework that she wasn't sure could be undone. "The operational assessment was real," he said, "and what happened after was also real. Both things happened. I can't make the first one not have happened, and I can't make the second one less real than it was." He stopped. "I know that's not sufficient." "No," she said, "it's not." Serena spoke from across the room quietly. "Elena." Elena looked at her. "The file was Victor's," Serena said. "Look at the email header, the originating address." Elena picked up the folder. She looked at the top of the first email page. The originating address had a domain she hadn't looked at closely before. She looked at it now. It wasn't Dante's. The emails had been sent to Dante. The assessment, the integration language, the proposal phase recommendation, all of it had been written by someone else and sent to him. She'd read it as his operation, his language, his architecture. She'd read his name in the recipient field as his authorship. She looked at the sign-off on the first message, a single initial. V. Victor Kane had constructed a psychological operation around Elena Voss and sent the progress reports to Dante Moretti as leverage, as insurance, as the specific kind of dirt that powerful men keep on each other, the documented evidence that can destroy a person's most important relationship at the moment of maximum vulnerability. Not Dante's operation, Victor's. Victor had been watching them both from the beginning. Elena set the folder down. She looked at Dante, who was looking at her with the expression she still couldn't name, and she understood that she was going to have to sit with an enormous amount of uncertainty about what was true and what had been constructed, and that sitting with it was not going to be comfortable or clean or quick. But she also understood something else. Victor Kane had put this folder in Dante's safe, or had it put there. Through access, she now had to assume he'd always maintained specifically for this moment. Specifically to be found, specifically to destroy the one alliance that stood between him and the conclusion of what Serena and Dante had spent 4 years building. She picked up the letters. The 2 letters from Victor. She looked at Dante. "Castillo needs these too," she said. "Tonight. Not in 48 hours. The secure channel isn't..." "Then we find another way." Her voice had the quality it had developed. In the last 20 minutes stripped, direct, no performance underneath it. Victor just told us exactly how much he knows about us and exactly how far ahead he's been planning. Which means 48 hours is not a timeline we have anymore. She set the letters back on the table. He's already inside everything. He's been inside everything from the start. Dante looked at the letters, then at the drive, then at her. If we move before the channel is secure, Serena said carefully, and the transmission is intercepted. If we wait 48 hours, Elena said, Victor has time to discredit everything on that drive before it reaches Castillo's team. He's had 30 years of relationships in this city, and he's had a 3-week head start on knowing that this operation is closing in on him. She met Serena's eyes. He will use every hour we give him. Serena looked at the drive in her hand. Then she did something Elena hadn't seen from her before she closed her eyes. Not for calculation this time, but for something else entirely. Brief private moment with whatever she carried that was not strategy or evidence or survival math, but just the weight of 7 years reduced to this room, this table, this choice. When she opened them, something had changed in her face. Call Castillo back, Serena said to Dante. Tell her we need the meeting tonight. Dante picked up the phone. Outside, the afternoon was tipping toward evening, the light going amber and long across the city, and Victor Kane was somewhere in it making his own calculations. And the window between what could still be saved and what couldn't was closing with the indifferent efficiency of a door swinging shut in a draft steady, certain, and not waiting for anyone to be ready. Castillo picked up on the second ring. Dante didn't identify himself. He said 4 words, we need it tonight, and waited. Islina watched his face across the table, watching for the tells that meant the answer. On the other end was no, watching for the specific compression around his eyes that meant he was about to have to argue. Instead, she saw something she hadn't expected. Relief. Brief, quickly managed, but there. He hung up after 90 seconds. She says, 9 o'clock, he said. There's a federal building on West Jackson. She'll have a team ready. That's 4 hours, Serena said. Yes. Elena looked at the window. The amber light had gone darker, the city shifting into its evening register. 4 hours. She thought about Victor Kane and what 4 hours looked like to a man who'd been operating inside the Moretti structure for 3 decades, who understood the city's architecture of power the way most people understood the layout of their own homes. 4 hours was either enough time or it wasn't, and there was no way to know which until it was over. We need to move the car, she said. Serena's car has been parked 2 blocks from my building. If Victor has people watching the penthouse, they've already logged it, Serena said. She said it without heat, just the flat acknowledgement of a woman who'd spent 7 years thinking 3 moves ahead on questions of her own survival. Doesn't matter now. What matters is the route to West Jackson. Dante was already at the laptop. I'll map 3 routes. We decide at the last possible moment which one we take. And if there's coverage on all 3, Elena said. He looked at her. Then we improvise. She almost said something about how improvisation had gotten them to a safe house apartment with blackout curtains. But she stopped herself because it wasn't useful, and because there was a part of her that was still processing the Manila folder and the V at the bottom of those emails and the question of what was real that she'd set aside in the interest of getting through the next 4 hours alive. She was going to have to set it aside a little longer. They spent the first hour doing preparation that looked mundane from the outside, eating again because Serena insisted, because her hands had started showing a faint tremor she didn't comment on, but which Elena read as the accumulated cost of 7 years of controlled living hitting a moment that required everything. Charging phones. Organizing the documentation into 2 separate physical packets, one that Serena would carry, one that Dante would carry, so that if they were separated in transit, Castillo's team would receive at least half regardless. Elena made herself eat, tasted nothing, drank the water Dante put in front of her. 6:30 Dante's phone rang. He looked at the screen and something happened in his face. It's Victor, he said. Nobody moved. The phone rang 4 times. 5 then stopped. 30 seconds later, a text message. Dante read it and his jaw went tight in the specific way it did when something had landed that he hadn't prepared for. He turned the phone so Elena and Serena could see the screen. I know where you are. I know what you're planning. Come talk to me before this goes somewhere none of us can walk back from. Alone, the warehouse on Paulina. You have 2 hours. Serena read it twice. He's bluffing about knowing our location. Maybe, Dante said. If he knew our location, he'd have sent people, not a text message. Or he's telling us he knows as a reason to get me to the warehouse, and the actual move is something else. Dante set the phone face down. He wants me separated from you, from the drive. Then don't go, Elena said. Dante looked at the phone through the table as though he could read through the back of it. If I don't respond at all, he said, he'll know we're moving tonight. The silence tells him as much as a reply would. So respond, Elena said. Tell him you need until tomorrow. Buy time. Dante picked up the phone and typed for 20 seconds and sent. Put it back down. They waited. The reply came in under a minute. Tomorrow is too late for both of us. 2 hours, Dante. After that, I stopped being patient. The room absorbed the message. He's already moving, Serena said. The patience line he's telling us, the clock is running regardless of what we decide. Elena felt something shift in the room's atmosphere, a pressure change, the particular feeling of time compressing. She looked at Dante, and she could see him working through it, the warehouse, the text, the timing, all of it, moving through the calculation engine he'd been running since childhood. I need to go to the warehouse, he said. No, Elena said. Absolutely not. If Victor is telling the truth about the timeline, trying to separate you from the drive, or he genuinely wants to negotiate before this goes federal, and if there's any possibility of that. Dante, her voice cut clean. He sent men to the brownstone. He had Hargrove compromised. He built a psychological file on me and put it in your safe. What exactly do you think he wants to negotiate? Dante was quiet. His hands were flat on the table. He might have something we don't know about yet, he said. Some piece of this we haven't seen. If he has leverage we haven't identified, and he uses it after we're in that federal building. Then we deal with it from inside federal protection, Elena said. Not in an abandoned warehouse with no backup. She's right, Serena said. For the third time, Elena noted, and each time it landed with the specific weight of a woman who did not say things lightly. Dante looked at his hands. Then he looked at Elena with an expression she was still learning the vocabulary of raw and complicated, and carrying more history than she could fully see. If something goes wrong tonight, he said, at the federal building, on the route, anywhere between here and 9 o'clock. Nothing is going to go wrong, she said. But if it does, Dante, she said his name quietly, not as a cut this time, but as something else. I'm still here, I'm still in this room. Whatever I need to figure out about us, I'm figuring it out on the other side of tonight. She held his gaze. So let's get to the other side of tonight. He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once. They left the apartment at 8:15, taking the route Dante had designated as secondary, not because they'd made a final decision between the 3 options, but because he said the secondary was the one with the most populated street-level coverage, the most witnesses, the most ambient foot traffic that would make a vehicle interception difficult to execute cleanly. Elena rode in the back again, Serena in the passenger seat, Dante driving. The city outside the windows had gone fully dark. Chicago in the evening had a specific energy. She usually liked the lit windows, the movement, the layered noise of a place that never quite powers down, but tonight it all looked like cover. Every parked car was a potential surveillance point. Every pedestrian was a variable she couldn't evaluate. She held the physical documentation packet on her lap with both hands and looked out the window and breathed. They were 6 blocks from the federal building when Dante said, "We've got a tail," in the same tone he might have used to note a change in weather. Elena didn't turn around. Serena didn't either. "Black sedan," Dante said. 4 cars back. It was behind us on Halston. It's made the last 2 turns. "Victors are independent," Serena said. "Can't tell from here. If we go directly to the building, they'll see where we're going. They don't already know." Elena thought about it. Thought about the 9 o'clock meeting, the federal team, waiting, the window that was closing with the indifference of physics. "Does it matter?" she said. "If they see where we're going, it's too late for them to do anything about it. We'll already be inside." "It matters if they have someone inside," Dante said. Car went quiet. "Castillo's team," Elena said slowly. "Victor has 30 years of relationships in this city," Dante said. "That includes federal relationships. I'm not saying Castillo is compromised. I'm saying I don't know that she isn't." Elena thought about Serena's 19-minute phone call that morning. The new contact, not the old one. The institutional knowledge that seemed right, but couldn't be fully verified. If we're wrong to trust Castillo, Elena said, and we walk into that building, we're handing Victor everything at once. Yes, Dante said, and if we don't go, Serena said, we have no move left. No backup, no channel, she paused. We have a drive full of evidence that cannot prosecute itself. The black sedan was still behind them. 4 cars back, steady, maintaining exactly the kind of distance that meant it was deliberate. Turn left, Elena said. Dante looked at her in the rearview mirror. Left takes us away from I know. Turn left. He turned. The sedan turned. 2 blocks up, she said. There's a bar on the corner. Busy on weeknights. Pull over. He pulled over. She was already getting out before the car had completely stopped, moving with the controlled deliberateness she'd developed over the last 24 hours. The new muscle memory of someone who has decided to stop waiting to feel ready before acting. Stay in the car, she said through the window. Both of you. Elena, Dante started. She was already on the sidewalk. She walked back toward the sedan. Not fast, not slow, hands visible. The sedan had stopped half a block back when Dante pulled over. Its windows were tinted but not blacked out. She could make out the shape of the driver, one person, no obvious passenger. She walked toward it with the specific purposefulness of someone who is done being surveilled and has decided to turn the situation around. She stopped at the driver's window and knocked on it with 2 knuckles. The window came down. The man behind the wheel was maybe 50, gray at his temples, wearing a jacket that was cut slightly wrong, slightly boxy, the way jackets are when they're covering something. He looked at her with an expression that was professionally neutral and personally alarmed, the expression of someone whose surveillance job had just collapsed into direct contact. Who sent you, she said. He said nothing. I'm going to assume Victor Kane, she said. You can confirm or not. It doesn't change my next sentence. She kept her voice level and her hands still. We're going to a federal building in 4 blocks. Whatever you're planning to do, you've approximately 7 minutes to do it in. And if anything happens to the people in that car in those 7 minutes, you will be the only person federal investigators can visually identify as having been present. She looked at him steadily. So I'd think about whether Victor Kane is worth that. The man stared at her. She held his gaze for 3 more seconds. Then she turned and walked back to Serena's car and got in. Drive, she said. Dante drove. She didn't look back. So she heard Serena exhale beside her a single controlled breath, the kind that releases something that has been held too long. After 2 blocks, Dante said it's not following, and she felt something unclench in the back of her neck that had been tight since they left the apartment. The federal building on West Jackson was lit and solid and institutional in a way that felt, at this specific moment, like the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. Castillo met them in a ground-floor conference room. She was younger than Elena had expected, early 40s, compact, brown hair, pulled back with the no-nonsense efficiency of someone who'd stopped thinking about it years ago. She had the particular quality of attention that Elena associated with people who'd learned to read rooms fast, who process threat assessments as naturally as other people process social cues. She looked at the 3 of them when they came in and said nothing for a moment. Just looked, and then she said, "You made it," a flatness that suggested she'd had reasons to doubt it. "We had company," Dante said. "I know. We picked up the tail on Halstead." She looked at Elena. "That was you at the sedan." Yes, Castillo held her gaze for a moment. "That was either very brave or very stupid. Both, probably," Elena said. Something shifted in Castillo's expression, not quite a smile, but adjacent. She looked at Serena. "You have the drive." Serena reached into her jacket and put the drive on the conference table. Castillo didn't pick it up immediately. She looked at it. 7 years, she said. Quiet. Not a question. 7 years, Serena said. Castillo picked it up. She handed it to a man standing at the far end of the table, who Elena hadn't fully clocked when they came in young glasses, the focused energy of a technical specialist. He took it and moved to a laptop, and Castillo turned back to the room. "I need to tell you something," she said, "before we go any further, because you're about to make decisions based on information you don't have yet, and I won't do this without full disclosure." The room went still. "Victor Kane contacted my office this afternoon," Castillo said. Elena felt it the lurch, the floor's reliability becoming theoretical again. He came in voluntarily, Castillo continued, 2 hours ago. He offered a cooperative testimony agreement. She looked at Dante. In exchange for immunity on secondary charges, he offered to provide documentation of the Moretti operations activities going back 22 years, including evidence of Carmine Moretti's arrangements with public officials. She paused. He also provided documentation of your involvement in the operation, Dante. Specific transactions, specific decisions, framed as evidence that you were continuing your father's criminal enterprise. Dante went completely still. The kind of still that is the opposite of calm, the stillness of total internal containment. Everything locked down, because if it isn't locked down, it will not be controllable. He moved first, Elena said. Her voice came out very even. She was proud of that and also didn't care about it at all. He moved first, Castillo confirmed. If you had come in tomorrow, as originally planned, my office would have already been 48 hours into processing his agreement. She looked around the table. He didn't know you were coming tonight. Can you reject the agreement? Serena said. I can complicate it, Castillo said. A cooperative agreement with one party doesn't preclude prosecution of that party on primary charges if subsequent evidence contradicts their testimony. She looked at the drive, where the technical specialist was already working. If what's on that drive directly contradicts Victor's account, if it shows Victor himself as a primary architect rather than a secondary participant, then his agreement becomes worthless, and he becomes the primary subject. He is the primary architect, Serena said. The financial structures, the official relationships, Victor built them. Carmen gave the authorization, but Victor designed the systems. Then show me, Castillo said. They were in the conference room for 2 hours. Elena sat at the table and watched Castillo's team work through the drive's contents with the methodical precision of people who did this for a living, and she answered questions when she was asked them, and she watched Dante do the same, answer questions, provide context, speak with a directness and specificity that was different from any version of him she'd seen. Not managed, not performing composure, just answering fully whatever was asked. It was, she thought, what honesty looked like on him. She hadn't known the texture of it before. She was learning it now. At 11:40, Castillo stepped out to take a call. She was gone for 8 minutes. When she came back, she stood at the head of the table and looked at all three of them. Victor Kane is in federal custody, she said. He was apprehended leaving O'Hare 40 minutes ago. A brief pause. He had a passport and approximately $90,000 in a carry-on. Nobody spoke. He wasn't negotiating, Dante said finally. Afternoon, he was buying time. Yes, Castillo said. He provided the cooperative agreement to delay your ability to move tonight, in the hope that by the time you came in tomorrow, he'd be on a plane. She looked at the drive. He underestimated the timeline. Elena thought about the text message. Come talk to me before this goes somewhere none of us can walk back from. The warehouse, the 2-hour window, the patient's line. All of it calculated to hold them in place while Victor Kane packed a carry-on and went to the airport. He'd been running. He'd been running the entire time he was telling them he wanted to talk. Serena was looking at the table. Her hands were folded in front of her, and her face was doing something private and internal that Elena didn't try to read. 7 years. She'd spent 7 years waiting for this specific night, and now it had arrived without the dramatic confrontation she might have imagined, just a phone call. A passport, an airport gate. It was almost anticlimactic. And then it wasn't, because Serena looked up, and something in her face had changed. Some long-held structural thing releasing, and Elena recognized it, even without a name for it. The particular physical expression of a weight that's been carried so long you've forgotten, it has mass finally setting down. Castillo looked at Dante. I need to be direct with you. Victor's documentation of your activities, even if it's contradicted by the drive's contents, creates a process I can't shortcut. There will be a formal review of your involvement in the Moretti organization. Your cooperation tonight is significant, and it will be considered. But I can't promise you the outcome of that review. I know, Dante said. You may want legal representation before this conversation goes any further. I know that too. He looked at Castillo steadily. I'm not done talking yet. Castillo held his gaze. Then she nodded once and sat down and opened her laptop. Elena watched him. She watched him begin the accounting, the full version, without management, without the controlled releases she'd grown used to receiving, and she understood that she was watching something she'd never seen before. Not Dante Moretti the heir, not Dante Moretti the feared name, not the man who left at 11, 17 every night without explanation. Just a man at a conference table in a federal building choosing, finally, not to be what he'd been built to be. It was not clean. It was not beautiful in any way she could have predicted. It was just the work of a person dismantling the architecture of their own survival, piece by piece, in a government conference room with fluorescent lighting. At 12:50 in the morning, Castillo called a break. She sent her team out for 10 minutes and looked at the three people still sitting at the table. "There's one more thing," she said. Her voice had shifted slightly, not softer, but something in the professional surface had moved. Victor Kane's testimony included a specific claim about this operation's internal security. She looked at Elena. Claimed that you were his source. The fluorescent light buzzed above them. Elena heard Serena make a very small sound that wasn't quite a word. Dante turned to look at her. She felt his gaze land on the side of her face like physical pressure. She looked at Castillo. He claimed I was feeding him information. Yes, about Dante's movements, about the brownstone location. Castillo's voice was still even, still professional. He provided 3 specific pieces of information that he claims originated with you. Elena looked at the table. She thought about the 6 weeks of midnight departures. The night she followed him. The photographs she found in his office. The text message with the unknown number that had sent her back to the penthouse. You need to see what's in his safe. The text message, she said. This afternoon. The one that sent me to the penthouse. Castillo waited. It came from an unknown number, Elena said. Victor sent it. He needed me back in that building, not to find the letters, but to find the folder. The one with my initials. She looked at Castillo. He wanted me to find it and believe it was Dante's. He wanted to break the alliance from the inside. She paused. And he needed me going back and forth to the penthouse on a specific afternoon so that his surveillance team could log the movement and he could claim it as evidence that I was running information for him. Castillo looked at her for a long moment. Can you verify the number the text came from? Elena said. We're running it now, Castillo said. It pinged a cell tower 2 blocks from O'Hare at the approximate time Victor was preparing to board. She paused. That's not conclusive, but it's consistent with your account. Elena felt Dante's gaze still on her. She turned and looked at him. His face had the expression she still hadn't fully mapped, complicated and raw, and carrying more than she could see. But underneath all of it, something she was only now learning to recognize as the particular look of a man who has done someone damage and knows it, and is not going to pretend otherwise. He almost got us, Elena said. Not to Castillo, to him. Yes, Dante said. He was ahead of us the whole time. Not at the end. His voice was quiet. At the end you made the calls. The sedan. Moving the meeting to tonight. He looked at her steadily. He didn't account for you. The fluorescent light buzzed. Somewhere down the corridor, a door opened and closed. Castillo stood. I'll give you 5 minutes, she said, and went to get her team. The 3 of them sat in the conference room at 12:50 in the morning, and the drive was in federal hands, and Victor Kane was in federal custody, and the thing that had been set in motion was no longer in motion, it had landed, with all the unglamorous weight of real consequences hitting real ground. Serena looked at her hands on the table. It's not finished, she said. Review, the prosecution, all of it. Months. Maybe more. I know, Dante said. Is gone, he said. Simply, it was already gone. I knew that when I agreed to let you make the call this morning. He looked at Serena. That was the decision. Everything after was just execution. Serena was quiet. Then I'm sorry it took this long. Don't, he said. Don't apologize for surviving. Elena watched them look at each other across the table, the half-brother and the half-sister, who'd found each other through a ledger entry and a death certificate that was a lie, who'd spent 4 years building something in secret while the city moved around them, who'd arrived at this conference room table on opposite sides of a life that had been split before either of them chose it. She felt, watching them, something that was not quite part of what she'd come in here with. Something that lived adjacent to the folder and the emails and the question of what was real. Something that made space for more than one true thing at once. Castillo's team came back through the door. Elena straightened in her chair and put her hands on the table and felt the night around them, enormous, unfinished, full of the kind of uncertainty that doesn't resolve in one sitting. And then the door at the far end of the corridor opened, and a different person came through it. Someone Elena hadn't seen before. Someone in a different kind of suit. And she watched Castillo look up, and she watched Castillo's face do something it hadn't done in the hours they'd been sitting here. She watched Castillo go still. "What is it?" Dante said. Castillo looked at him, then at the person in the doorway, then back at Dante. "Victor Kane's attorney," she said, "filed an emergency injunction 40 minutes ago." Her voice had the quality of someone reporting weather they don't like but cannot change. Claiming the evidence obtained through Serena Vale's federal contact was acquired through an unauthorized operation outside proper jurisdictional channels. She paused. A judge signed it. The room was very quiet. "The drive," Serena said. "Currently under a hold," Castillo said, "pending a jurisdictional review." She looked at the technical specialist, then back. "We cannot use it until the injunction is resolved." Elena looked at the drive, sitting on the table where the specialist had set it down. Sitting exactly where it had been for the last 2 hours, holding everything they'd built, everything Serena had carried for 7 years, everything that was supposed to end this. Temporarily untouchable. Outside the federal building's windows, Chicago moved through its night with the vast indifference of a city that has seen everything and forgotten most of it, and Victor Kane's attorney had just bought his client time from inside a holding cell, and the window that had seemed 20 minutes ago to be closing on the right side of history had. Castillo didn't move for 3 seconds. That was the thing Elena would remember later, not the injunction itself, not the word hold, or the phrase jurisdictional review, or the specific legal mechanism Victor Kane's attorney had used to buy his client breathing room from inside a federal holding cell. What she would remember was Castillo standing at the head of that conference table, not moving for 3 full seconds, which was 2 seconds longer than a woman like Castillo spent processing anything. Then Castillo looked at the man in the doorway and said, "Get Reeves on the phone. Right now." The man went back through the door. Elena looked at the drive sitting on the table. She thought about the word temporary hold. Temporary meant something, even if she couldn't see the shape of it yet. "What is a jurisdictional review?" she said in real terms. "How long?" Castillo pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. "In real terms, it depends on the judge and the argument." Victor's attorney is claiming the initial contact between Serena and the federal office 8 years ago was conducted outside proper protocol, which means any evidence chain originating from that contact is procedurally tainted. She looked at Serena. "Is there any merit to that argument?" Serena was quiet for a moment. Kind of quiet that has history in it. "Reyes operated within his authority," she said. "He documented everything properly. I have copies of the initial contact documentation. It's on the drive, in the secondary folder." "Then the argument has no merit," Castillo said. "But a signed injunction is a signed injunction. We need to challenge it in front of the same judge, or escalate above him, and to do either we need Reeves, who is my division chief, and whose phone I am apparently waiting for someone to reach." She said it without obvious frustration, but the effort of containment was visible in the line of her shoulders. Dante had not spoken since the injunction was announced. Elena could feel him beside her, the particular quality of his stillness that she now recognized as the absolute maximum of his self-containment, the point just before something gives. She put her hand on the table close enough to his that their fingers were touching, and she didn't look at him, and he didn't look at her, and neither of them moved their hands. Serena was looking at the drive. "The documentation of the initial contact," Elena said. "That's on the drive, and the drive is under a hold." "I have paper copies," Serena said, "at the brownstone." She paused. "Or I did." The brownstone, which had been surveilled, which men with radio equipment had encircled 2 nights ago, which Elena had not been back to, and had no way of knowing the current state of. "If Victor's people went through the brownstone," Elena said, "they would have taken everything they could carry," Serena said. Her voice was still flat, still controlled, but something underneath it was thin in a way it hadn't been before. "If they found the physical copies of the initial contact documentations, Victor's attorney doesn't need to destroy them," Dante said. His voice came back into the room with the weight of someone who'd been thinking while others were talking. He just needs to argue their absence. If the only physical copies are missing and the digital copies are under a hold, the injunction has teeth regardless of what Reyes documented 8 years ago. He looked at Castillo. Is that right? Castillo said nothing for a moment, which was its own answer. There's something else, Dante said. He was looking at the middle of the table. My testimony tonight. The accounting I gave you before the injunction was filed. It's on record, Castillo said. Can it be used independently of the drive? Not for prosecution of Victor Kane. Your testimony is corroborating evidence. Without the primary documentation on the drive being admissible, your account alone doesn't establish the evidentiary chain we need. She paused. It helps, but it doesn't close the case. The room was very quiet. Lena's mind was moving through it the way it moved through problems when she was tired enough that the polite filtering was gone, and the raw mechanical thinking was what was left. The injunction needed the initial contact documentation to fall apart. The initial contact documentation was either in the brownstone or on the drive. The drive was under a hold. The brownstone was potentially compromised. But Serena had been living in that brownstone for 14 months. She had organized that space with the specific paranoia of a woman who understood that her survival depended on redundancy. Elena looked at Serena. The paper copies, she said. Were they in one location in the brownstone? Serena met her eyes. Something moved through her expression, not hope, which would have been premature, but the specific alertness of someone, recognizing the direction a question is going. No, Serena said slowly. I kept the primary file in the study. But there's a secondary copy. She stopped. Behind the baseboard panel in the kitchen. Under the sink. Would Victor's people know to look there? Victor's people would look everywhere. How long would it take them to be thorough? Serena thought about it. The brownstone is 4 floors, including the basement. A thorough search, every panel, every built-in, every place that could have been modified 6 hours minimum. They were working fast, and they knew what they were looking for. She paused. They didn't know exactly what they were looking for. Longer. Elena looked at the clock on the wall. 1:14 in the morning. Victor's men had come to the brownstone 2 nights ago. 48 hours. She did the arithmetic that she didn't want to do and arrived at an answer she liked even less. They've had enough time to be thorough, she said. Yes, Serena said, but not necessarily enough time to have reported back to Victor's attorney with specific confirmation of what they found. Elena looked at Castillo. Victor filed the injunction from custody, which means he filed it based on what he knew before he was arrested, not on what his people found at the brownstone after. Castillo was looking at her with an expression that had sharpened. He didn't know about the secondary copy, Elena continued. He knew about the primary file in the study, which his people may or may not have found. But the argument his attorney made to the judge was based on the assumption that all physical documentation was either destroyed or inaccessible. She held Castillo's gaze. The secondary copy is still in that brownstone. The injunction's foundation collapses. Castillo looked at Serena. If we retrieve it tonight. It changes the evidentiary picture significantly, Serena said. The initial contact documentation is time-stamped and countersigned by Reyes and by the field office intake coordinator from 8 years ago. Victor can't claim procedural irregularity if the original intake paperwork is physically present and intact. The brownstone may still be under observation, Dante said. The brownstone may be completely cleared, Elena said. Victor's people accomplished what they came for, or they think they did. They have no reason to maintain a presence there. Or they left someone to watch for exactly this, Dante said. Yes, Elena said, both are possible. She looked at him. One of them ends with Victor Kane walking out of federal custody on a procedural argument. The other one doesn't. Dante held her gaze for a long moment. His jaw shifted. She could see the calculation running the risk assessment, the probability weighting, all of the machinery he'd built over a lifetime of surviving a world that was actively trying to use him. Then he looked at Castillo. Can you get us to the brownstone with federal cover? I can get you there, Castillo said. Federal cover in an active case with a current injunction is complicated. Complicated as in no or complicated as in paperwork. Castillo almost smiled. Complicated as in I send 2 of my people as civilian observers on an unrelated property check while I work the phone with Reeves. She stood. Give me 15 minutes. She left the room. The 15 minutes were the longest Elena had sat through in 2 days of long minutes. Serena went to the corner and stood with her back to the wall, and her arms folded, and her eyes somewhere internal. And Dante sat with his elbows on the table, and his face in his hands for about 30 seconds, just 30 seconds of not performing anything. Just a man with his face in his hands, and then he lifted his head and looked at Elena. "I need to say something," he said. "Not now," she said. "Yes, now." While I still stopped, pressed his lips together. "Folder. Victor's file on you. I need you to know that I received those reports, and I didn't ask for them, and I didn't act on them." Elena looked at him. "I know. The emails, I read the headers," she said. "I know they came from Victor. I know they went to you." She paused. "I also know you kept them." He was quiet. "You kept them the way you kept everything," she said. "Documentation. Survival behavior. You've had a file on yourself since you were 24 years old." She held his gaze. "I understand that. I don't entirely like it, but I understand it." "That's not absolution," he said. "No," she said. "It's not." She looked at the table. "We have a lot to figure out. But we're going to figure it out on the other side of this, and that means we need to get through this first." She looked back at him. "So that's what we're doing." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached across and covered her hand with his again, the cut on his palm, rough against her knuckles, and she let him. "Castillo came back in 12 minutes, not 15. 2 of my people are outside," she said. "They'll take you. I have Reeves on a call in 20 minutes, and I will have the injunction challenged before dawn, or I will have a very productive argument with a federal judge about what constitutes procedural taint." She looked at Serena. "The secondary copy, if it's there, it comes back here directly. Don't evaluate it at the location. Don't photograph it. Don't do anything with it except bring it to me intact." "Understood," Serena said. "And if Victor's people are still there—" "We leave," Dante said. "We don't engage. We leave and we call you." Castillo looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded. The drive to the brownstone took 11 minutes. Senna sat between Dante and Serena in the back of the federal vehicle unmarked, a dark blue sedan that looked like nothing, and watched the city move past the windows and thought about nothing useful. Just let the motion of the car be the thing she tracked until they were there. The street was quiet. The brownstone looked the same as it always had, which meant nothing and everything. Serena scanned it for 30 seconds before she moved. "One light on the second floor," she said. "That's not mine." Everyone in the car went still. "I leave a light on a timer in the study," Serena said. "Second floor left. That's the right side." Elena looked at the building. The lit window was on the right side of the second floor, not the left. "Someone's inside," one of the federal agents said. "Or left something on," Dante said. "I don't leave lights on I didn't account for," Serena said. They sat in the car for 2 minutes, watching. The light didn't move. No shadows crossed it. The street was empty in both directions. "Kitchen is ground floor rear," Serena said. "There's an access point through the side yard. If I go in from the back, I don't cross the sight line of that window." "You're not going in alone," Dante said. "You're not coming with me," Serena said. "If there's someone in there, and they see you, it becomes something different." She looked at him with the direct, stripped-down clarity that Elena had come to understand was just how Serena's face worked when she'd made a decision. "I know that building. I know every board that creaks and every door that sticks." "You don't." She looked at Elena. "Neither do you." Dante opened his mouth. "She's right," Elena said. Closed it. Serena was out of the car in one smooth motion. She moved along the sidewalk without hurry, not the gait of someone sneaking, which reads wrong to any observer, but the ordinary movement of someone who lives on this street and is coming home at a slightly inconvenient hour. She turned into the side yard passage without pausing, without looking back. Elena watched the second-floor window. Nothing moved. Beside her, Dante was very still. She could hear his breathing controlled, metered, the specific rhythm of someone who is managing a physiological stress response through conscious override. She recognized it because she was doing the same thing. 4 minutes passed, then 6. At 7 minutes, the federal agent in the front seat said quietly, "If she's not out in 3 more minutes." "She'll be out," Dante said. At 9 minutes, Serena came back through the side yard passage, walking the same ordinary pace, turned toward the car. Got in. In her hand was a manila envelope, letter-sized, slightly worn at the corners. She held it without squeezing it, carefully, The way you hold something that has been kept safe for a long time and needs to stay that way a little longer. The light was a timer malfunction, she said. No one was there. She looked at the envelope in her hand. Elena watched her look at it, watched the 7 years move through her face in the space of a breath. All of it. The brownstone and the borrowed names and the medication, and the nights of not being able to go to a hospital or a grocery store in daylight, or any of the 100 ordinary things that people do without thinking, because they are not people whose fathers ordered their deaths. Go, Serena said. They were back at the federal building by 2:45. Castillo was on the phone when they came in, and she held up one finger without looking at them and kept talking. And they stood in the corridor and waited. And Elena leaned against the wall and felt the exhaustion hit her properly for the first time, not the surface tiredness of a late-night net, but the deep structural fatigue of a person whose body has been running on emergency fuel for 48 hours and has finally registered that the emergency is passing. Castillo hung up. She looked at the envelope. Serena handed it to her. Castillo opened it carefully, examined the top document without removing it fully, and then looked up. This is the intake form, she said. Reyes's signature and the field office stamp. Yes, Serena said. This collapses the procedural argument. Castillo looked at the envelope with an expression Elena couldn't entirely read, but which had the quality of something long prepared arriving exactly when needed. I have Reeves on a 3-way call with the duty judge at 6 a.m. The injunction will be vacated before noon. Nobody cheered. Nobody made any sound of celebration. It wasn't that kind of moment. It was too late and too worn and too complicated for celebration, and all three of them understood that what was ending tonight was the crisis, not the consequence. Consequence was going to take months. The consequence was going to require lawyers and federal testimony, and the long, unglamorous work of dismantling something that had taken 3 decades to build. But the drive was no longer under a permanent hold. And Victor Kane was not getting on a plane, and Serena Vale had an envelope in a federal agent's hands that proved she'd always been telling the truth. That was enough for tonight. That had to be enough. The debrief lasted until 4:30 in the morning. Elena answered every question she was asked with a precision that surprised her, considering the hour and the state of her. She described the text message, the sedan, the penthouse, the folder with her initials. She described what she'd seen at the brownstone on the night she followed Dante. She described 6 weeks of 11, 17 departures and what they'd cost her and what they'd eventually led to, and she used plain language throughout. No embellishment, no performance, just the account. When she was finished, Castillo looked at her across the table and said, "You held a lot together under pressure." "I had reasons to," Elena said. She didn't elaborate. Castillo didn't ask. Dante's formal statement took longer. He was thorough in a way that Elena understood was deliberate and chosen, not the selective thoroughness of someone managing disclosure, but the complete version, including his own operational decisions over the 4 years of building toward this night, including the mistakes, including the 3 weeks he'd known about Victor's awareness of Serena and hadn't told her. He said all of it without being asked to and without softening the edges. She sat beside him for part of it and left the room for another part, because there were things in the account that were difficult to sit still through, things that required her to process from a short distance rather than a zero distance. She stood in the corridor and drank bad coffee from a machine down the hall and looked at the institutional wall and let the processing happen without trying to manage it. Serena found her there at some point near 5 in the morning. They stood beside each other in the corridor without speaking for a while. Elena thought about the first time she'd seen Serena the Iron Gate, the streetlight, the easy confidence of someone who'd learned not to show fear. She thought about everything that had lived inside that image that she hadn't been able to see. "What happens to you now?" Elena said finally. Serena looked at the far end of the corridor. "Stop hiding," she said, simply like it was a small thing. Like it wasn't the largest thing she'd said since Elena had known her. That's not as easy as it sounds. "No." Serena's mouth curved slightly. "But I've been practicing being afraid for 7 years. I expect the other thing takes practice too." She paused. "There's a foundation I've been planning. For people who've had to disappear from their own lives because of organized crime. Navigation resources, legal advocacy, practical support." She turned to look at Elena. I've had a lot of time to design it. Elena looked at her. How much of the planning was something to do, and how much was something to believe in? Serena held her gaze. Both, she said. Can it be both? Yes, Elena said. It can. They went back inside when Castillo called them. The sky outside the building's high windows had begun to shift, not light yet, but the beginning of the movement toward it, the dark thinning at its edges. Elena noticed it without fully registering it, and then a moment later, registered it fully. Dawn was coming. The night had lasted as long as it was going to last. The months that followed did not move quickly. Elena had understood intellectually that legal processes grind slowly, that dismantling a 3-decade criminal enterprise through proper evidentiary channels was not the work of weeks. She had understood it and been wrong about what understanding it actually felt like from the inside. Victor Kane's attorney fought every step. The injunction was vacated by noon, the day after their night in the federal building, as Castillo had promised, but the legal challenges that followed it came in waves, procedural motions, continuances, specific grinding machinery of a man with resources and connections, using every available tool to create distance between himself and consequence. There were days when Elena read the updates from Castillo and felt the fatigue of it in her chest, the particular exhaustion of a fight that keeps being rescheduled instead of concluded. But it moved, slowly, unglamorously, with setbacks that required absorbing and regrouping. It moved. Carmine Moretti died in the 4th month, a stroke in a private medical facility on the North Shore, with no ceremony and no public announcement. Elena read about it in a brief news item and sat with it for a while and felt something that wasn't grief and wasn't satisfaction and didn't have a clean name. She thought about Dante and what it caught him the end of a man who had never been a good father, but who had been the architect of everything Dante was made from. And the particular complexity of grieving someone whose absence is also in some ways a relief. She didn't ask Dante how he felt about it. She waited until he told her in his own time, on a Tuesday evening in the apartment they'd moved to when it became clear the penthouse was going to be part of the asset review process. He told her at the kitchen table over coffee that had gone cold, and he told her without managing the telling, without performing composure, and it was difficult and honest, and she stayed at the table until he was finished. Dante's formal cooperation agreement with Castillo's office took 11 weeks to finalize. The asset review took longer. What emerged from it was not nothing the legitimate business holdings, the real estate investments he'd built separately from the organization, the parts of his professional life that predated or operated outside the Moretti structure, but it was considerably less than what he'd had. He approached this with the specific kind of equanimity that Elena had learned to distinguish from suppression, not the performed calm of a man containing feeling, but the actual steadiness of a man who had made a decision and was living inside the consequences of it without resistance. She watched him do it. She paid attention to what it looked like. She paid attention because she was figuring out, day by day, what was real. Not the dramatic version of the question, not the folder and the emails and the cold shock of that afternoon in the penthouse office. She was past the shock. What she was doing now was the quieter, more demanding work of looking at 2.5 years of experience, and deciding what she trusted and what she didn't, and what she needed more time with. It wasn't clean and it wasn't quick, and there was no single moment that resolved it. There were many moments, accumulated, like anything that actually changes a person. The moment he came home from a meeting with Castillo's office and sat down on the couch and said, without preamble, they're satisfied with the cooperation. No criminal exposure. And she had looked at him and seen the thing she'd needed to see not relief that he'd gotten away with something, but the relief of a man who'd done a hard thing correctly and was now on the other side of it. The moment she found him at the kitchen table at 2 a.m, with a legal pad covered in notes, working out a structure for something she didn't recognize. And when she asked, he said he was looking at a licensing pathway for a logistics consulting firm. Completely legal, modest in scope, starting from the actual beginning. The moment he told her about his father's last visit, which he'd made alone, which he'd never told her about until 3 months after Carmine died. He'd gone to this facility and sat in a chair and said very little, and listened to a man who was diminished and frightened, in the way that very powerful people sometimes become when their bodies start failing, and he'd driven home afterward and not cried until he was in the parking garage of the apartment building, alone in the car. He told her about the parking garage, He told her about the crying. She put her hand on the back of his neck and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that was better than being present. Those moments accumulated. That was what decided it, in the end. Not a single revelation, not a dramatic declaration. Just the accumulated weight of a person choosing, in the specific small moments that constitute a life, to be honest rather than managed. Victor Kane's trial began in the 8th month. Serena testified. Elena was in the courtroom for the first day and the last day, and several days in between, sitting in the gallery with the particular stillness of someone watching something they helped build reach its conclusion. Victor Kane did not look at Serena when she testified. He looked at the table in front of him with the expression of a man who had spent 30 years never being held accountable, and was now sitting inside the unfamiliar architecture of it, trying to find a position that was bearable. He was convicted on 14 counts. The sentencing came 6 weeks later. Elena was not in the courtroom for the sentencing. She was at the new office Serena had established for the foundation, 2 rooms above a dry cleaner on the west side, full of second-hand furniture and stacked files, and the organized energy of something being built from the beginning, by someone who knows exactly what they're building and why. Elena had been helping 2 days a week for the last 3 months, not as a professional affiliation, just as the particular kind of helping that happens when a person has skills another person needs, and proximity to a purpose that feels worth getting up for. Serena called her when the verdict came through. She said 2 words, 14 counts. And then she was quiet for a moment, and Elena could hear in the quality of that silence the 7 years, and the brownstone, and the iron gate, and the woman who had not let the city make her disappear, even when it tried, who had held a blood-stained ledger in a parking garage, and decided that wasn't going to be the end. "How does it feel?" Elena said. Serena was quiet for another moment. "Like a window opening," she said finally. "That's the best I can do." "That's enough," Elena said. On a morning in late October, almost a year after the night Elena had stood at a kitchen door in her socks and watched Dante Moretti leave without explanation, she sat at the table in the apartment they shared and drank her coffee and listened to the city starting up outside. Dante was still asleep. She'd woken early the way she had for most of her adult life. That internal clock that didn't care about weekends or recovery, or the fact that they'd stayed up late the night before, talking about nothing in particular, his plans for the consulting firm, a documentary she'd watched. Question of whether Serena was actually going to move out of the West Side, now that she could live anywhere she chose, and the conclusion they'd reached together that Serena was probably going to stay on the West Side, because she'd chosen it when she had no choices, and you don't abandon a thing like that. She drank her coffee and watched the light come through the kitchen window, and thought about nothing structured. Just let the morning be the morning. When Dante came out of the bedroom, he was rumpled in a way she'd come to value the version of him that existed before he was fully assembled, before the day required anything from him. He poured himself coffee and sat across from her, and they were quiet together in the way that 2 people are quiet when the silence doesn't require filling. After a while he said, "You were watching the clock last night." She looked at him. "What?" 11:15, 11:16. He wrapped both hands around his mug. "You did it without noticing, old habit." She had done it. She'd felt herself do it and noted it and said nothing. "It's only been a year," she said, "I know." He held her gaze. "I'm not criticizing. I'm just stopped." Set down the mug. "I know what those weeks cost you. The counting. The following. All of it." He looked at his hands. "I'm aware of what I ask of a person, being in proximity to the kind of decisions I've made." "You're not making those decisions anymore," she said. "No, but the record of them exists." He looked up. "You deserve to be with someone who doesn't have that record." She looked at him across the table in the October morning light. Rumpled and honest and slightly afraid, which was the version of him she'd been learning to trust. Not the composed version, this one. "I know what I deserve," she said. "I've been making that assessment myself for 34 years, and I'm fairly good at it." She picked up her coffee. "What I'm with is what I chose. Those are different questions." He was quiet. "I'm not saying it's simple," she said. "I'm saying simple was never what I was looking for." She held his gaze. "Are you going to ask me to marry you again? Or did that get dissolved in the asset review?" He blinked. Then something moved through his face, the specific thing she'd been cataloging all year, the expression she'd finally found a name for. It was the look of a man who was not performing anything. just feeling it plainly without management. I was going to ask you on a better morning than this, he said. This is a fine morning, she said. He reached across the table and took her hand. Not the careful, deliberate gesture of a man who has practiced it. Just reached and took it, the cut on his palm long since healed, his hand warm from the coffee mug. Outside, the city was fully awake now, layered and enormous and indifferent in the way that cities are, going about its vast ordinary business of people moving through their lives and making their choices and paying their prices, and occasionally, on some mornings, in some apartments, in some ordinary buildings, arriving somewhere worth arriving at. Elena looked at his hand over hers. She thought about the woman she'd been a year ago, standing in a kitchen, in her socks, counting nights. She thought about what it cost to follow someone into the dark, not knowing what you'd find there. She thought about alleys and iron gates, and a conference table at 2 a.m, and a woman in a corridor at 5 a.m, who said I stop hiding like it was a small thing, when it was the largest thing she'd ever said. She thought about what it meant to stop waiting for clarity, before you committed to something. To decide that you were going to be present for a thing before you knew how it ended. She looked at Dante. Ask me, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Just looked, the way he had that first night at the auction, the quality of attention that felt like being seen all the way through. Except now she knew what was behind it. She'd been behind the door. She knew the room. Will you marry me, he said, no ring. Staging. Just the question, plainly, at a kitchen table on an October morning with coffee going cold, and the city outside the window going about its life. She thought about it for exactly 1 second. Yes, she said. On the condition that when I ask where you're going, you tell me. Every time, he said. Every time, she said, without exception. Without exception. She nodded. He turned her hand over and held it properly, and they sat like that in the quiet morning, and the light moved through the window the way light does when it has nowhere particular to be, slow and without urgency. And outside the city kept its noise and its motion, and its vast complicated life, and inside the apartment the silence was the kind that two people make together when they have stopped performing for each other and started just being there. That was how it ended. Not with the door closing. With one finally staying open.